Hey guys, so for this tutorial we're going to go over how to import an entire scene or architectural model into Maya from both Rhino and SketchUp. So I just have a blank Maya file open for this, and then I also have a SketchUp model and a Rhino model of the Farnsworth house, and we'll use this as a model for this tutorial. And when I say importing and exporting a whole scene, I mean a 3D model that has a bunch of different components to it, as opposed to maybe just like a single model. In the first Maya tutorial, I kind of briefly went over how to export a masking model, and we kind of did it piece by piece. This is going to be the same sort of workflow. So we'll start with Rhino. What you'll notice is that my Rhino file has everything layered by sort of type of object. So I've got ground, border, which is this little gray thing. The intent was to kind of model or 3D model this as if it were like a physical model. So I've got like a box that this model would sit in. It's just kind of a different way of 3D modeling something, so you don't have to worry about all of the extents around the scene. Floors are on a layer. The individual tiles for the floors are on their own layer. The roof, structure, window frames, window panes. So you guys can go through and see how this is organized, and you want to be really careful about how you organize your Rhino model, because that's going to make it a lot easier to export. Because what we want to do is be able to export this model layer by layer, so that when we bring it into Maya, Maya organizes it layer by layer. It makes it a lot easier to animate. And then the same thing goes for our SketchUp model. Now SketchUp doesn't really have layers anymore. This is kind of a SketchUp 2020 thing. Instead it has what's called tags. You can tag things how you want them, however you want to, but the important thing here is that the components of the building in SketchUp are modeled through components. So when I select these sort of structural pieces, those structural pieces exist as their own component. So I can double click on the component and I've got these structural pieces that I can then go in and edit. That's really important because SketchUp likes to automatically join surfaces, and we don't want this I-beam to join with the surface of this roof structure. It makes it impossible to export this as a separate layer than this, which you need to be able to do so that when it imports into Maya, you can select these things individually and keyframe them individually. So just remember, when you're modeling something that is going to be exported for Maya in SketchUp, you have to model through components based on the different parts of the structure and the building. And in Rhino, you just need to model and make sure everything gets layered correctly. And I'll show you what happens when you don't layer things correctly or you don't export things separately. So let's hop into this. Let's start with Rhino. The first thing we need to do in Rhino is convert everything to a mesh. Right now, this is a NURB surface, which is native to Rhino modeling. Maya likes to use polygon modeling or meshes, so we're just going to kind of convert everything to a mesh before we bring it into, or before we export it to Maya. So we're just going to, one whole step, I'm just going to select everything, type mesh, hit enter, and this polygon mesh options, I'm just going to put this all the way up, so I've got a higher resolution mesh when it converts it. Sometimes if this is too far down, if you have like detailed components or anything that has a curved surface to it, if this is too low, those curved surfaces will look kind of faceted or jagged. You don't want that. So let's just keep this all the way up. I'll click OK. It's going to run through and create a mesh out of every piece. Now the nice thing is all those meshes are still properly layered. So we don't need to worry about relayering anything. what it's done is created those meshes and put them directly underneath all the NURB surfaces. Now I still have all of my NURB surfaces selected, so I'm just going to hit the delete button. Okay. Oftentimes I'll save this as a new Rhino file before I do this because I'm deleting all those NURB surfaces. You don't really want to lose them. So if you guys are worried about that, go ahead and save your Rhino file as a new Rhino file before you convert everything to a mesh. But right now I've got all of these now converted to meshes. And all I'm going to do, I'm going to turn off the roof and I'm going to zoom into some of my more detailed components just to make sure that they look okay and that they're going to render okay. So like, for example, this stovetop has some detailed parts to it. So when I zoom in, and I'm going to switch to my rendered view, I just want to make sure that all of that looks smooth. There's not any weird jagged parts or pieces. It looks okay. Check the handles as well. You want to make sure everything kind of has a nice resolution to it, so it's a nice dense mesh. And that's okay. So now I'll switch back into my shaded view and turn that roof back on. So the first thing I'm going to do is show you what happens if I select everything and export it to Maya all at one time. This is not what you want to do. I'm going to export it, so I'll type export. When you're exporting meshes between different software, you export as a .obj. So I'm going to throw this just on my desktop. It's fine. Actually, I'm going to throw in storage D. Switch this to obj and just call this Farnsworth House Hole. I'll save it there. When your obj options box comes up, you want to make sure polygon mesh objects is selected, and under formatting you want to make sure map Rhino Z to objy is selected. What you're going to notice is your up axis in Rhino is Z, and if I switch to Maya, my up axis is Y. And so if this is not checked, your model is going to import into Maya sideways, which you don't want. So just make sure that's checked and click OK. So that's going to take a second and export. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hop into Maya and I'm going to do a file, import, go to that spot on my computer where I saved this, Farnsworth House Hole. I'm going to click import. Okay. Then I'm going to tap F on my keyboard to zoom out. And you're going to notice a couple of things I'm going to kind of go through, but before we get into any of that stuff, if you select the object, you're going to notice it comes in as a single selectable mesh. We do not want that. I can't select individual parts and pieces and animate this. I can't do like an exploded axon. I can't, select just that column or the series of columns on their own. This is pretty useless in terms of being able to produce an animation, right? I can't like select the roof and pull it up. It's not working for me. So you never, ever, ever want to select and export everything in your scene all at one time. That just doesn't work. So I'm going to delete this. Hit F on my keyboard to zoom back into my grid. And let's kind of go over the proper way to export this geometry. And this is why it's so important to layer your objects well. Because what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through. I'm going to right click on my layer, select objects, type export. I'm going to create a folder that's just called OBJs. And I'm going to export each layer to their own OBJ file. So I'll call this one ground. And you want to name them well too. Again, under formatting, make sure your polygon mesh objects is selected and your map Rhino Z to OBJY is selected, and click OK. You want to make sure these are labeled properly because, you want to make sure that when you save the exported OBJ, that you name it properly. So when I select border, select objects, export, I'll call this border. This is the name Maya is going to give it when you import it into Maya. So it's helpful to name objects appropriately. Take the time to do that. Don't just name it like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or something random like that. It just helps you stay organized. So I'll save that. This should be set once you do it one time. You don't need to keep checking it. So just click OK. Deselect, select the floors, export, floors, save. Okay. I'm just going to run through every single layer. I'm going to ignore the furniture and curtains layer. I don't want those for this particular Maya file. They're a little heavy and they'll make your animations lag a little bit. Okay, so that's all of the objects exported. You can navigate to that folder. Just kind of check you have all these OBJ files kind of set in that folder. So then what we're going to do is pop back into Maya and import all of that geometry that we just exported. So what we're going to do is we'll go to File, Import, and I'm going to select the border first just so I can get an idea as to the extent of the model. So I'll click Import, and that border is going to drop in. Now before I bring in my next piece of geometry, there's just one quick edit I want to make to the piece that I just brought in, and that's to weld the vertices together. Sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes when you bring in geometry from Rhino and SketchUp, vertices will not be welded together. And what I mean by that is this. If I select this object, I hold down right click and I select vertices. So I can select the individual vertices of this piece of geometry. What you would assume is that that is just one single vertice, right? Where 4 edges intersect, I've got a single vertice. Well, if I select that and I turn on my move tool, if I pull this vertice out, you're going to notice that they're not in fact joined. It's not just one vertice, okay? For whatever reason, these vertices did not weld together, which we don't want. That creates longer render times. It creates a whole host of problems. So the quick fix for that is to go back into object mode, hold down right click, select the object, go up to mesh, edit mesh, merge, and just click that. And it's going to select all the vertices, turn them yellow. And what that's done, if I go back into my vertice mode and I select one of those vertices, I'll turn on my move tool. When I pull this out, all of those vertices are going to stay welded together. Okay, so that's just a cleaner piece of geometry. So import your first mesh or group of meshes, go up to edit mesh, merge. Okay, not merge to center, just merge. If you do merge to center, it's going to merge everything to a single point on your Maya file, so you don't want to do that. So just remember that every time you import something, select it, edit mesh, merge. So then I'll bring in the next piece of geometry, and I'll bring in the ground just so I have a reference point for that as well. So I'll select it, edit mesh, merge. Okay. Now a couple things that you might run into when you're importing and exporting geometry is you might get like a glitching effect, something like this, where you have all this kind of glitchy black stuff show up all over your model, and it also might result in your model kind of disappearing when you zoom out too far. Okay, what that is that's your near and far clip plane setting for your camera. So we want to get rid of the glitchiness, and if you're importing objects that are really big, like skyscraper scale big, they might import but not show up on your screen, even though they show up in your outliner. If that's the case, all you have to do is come up to the top of your viewport where this little camera icon is. Click that, the one with the little cogwheel, and that's going to open up your camera attributes. And right under the first tab, you're going to see near clip plane and far clip plane. Now, if your object isn't showing in your Maya scene, all you have to do is come into your far clip plane and add a bunch of zeros, and it's going to start to show up. So now I can zoom out, and that object's like not going to disappear. And it will make objects that are really big show up in your scene. And then in order to get rid of that sort of glitching effect, that's your near clip plane. So I'm going to put this up to like 1. Hit enter, and that's going to clean up all of that glitching effect. Okay, you just want to make sure that when you zoom out, it doesn't really show. So that's now like a much cleaner looking model. Okay, so let's continue to import the rest of our 3D model. So file, import, just start at the top. And it's going to import, and then you can zoom in to kind of check it, make sure it looks okay. Again, I'm going to select it, edit mesh, merge, and just make sure all of that stuff is merged together. If that happens, undo, go up to edit mesh, and where it says merge, you have this little options box. Click that. You want to set your threshold a lot lower, so I'm going to set this to 0.0001, and then click apply, and those shouldn't like merge to the center like that. If that occurs where you do an edit mesh merge and it looks like all the vertices merge to a single point, that's your threshold. This is kind of like the radius in which it allows 2 vertices to merge together. So like if it's too large, that vertice will try and merge with that vertice. So you just want to set this really low. So 0.0001 would be okay. So that's how you kind of troubleshoot that. So then let's bring in our next piece. Cabinets. Do edit mesh, merge. And then I'm going to go through the rest and sort of bring that in. Okay, so that's all of our geometry brought into our scene. You don't need to worry about all the edges that show up. It'll render as if they're not there, so I can turn those edges off. And that's what the model's going to look like. I just keep them on because it's a little easier to see what the geometry looks like. So the next thing we'll do is I'm going to go over how to export from SketchUp. And it's the same exact process to import, so I'm not going to go through all of that again. But the important thing is that when you import things sequentially like that, I can now select this as its own object and move it around separately from every other piece of object that's in my scene. So if I'm doing an exploded axon and I want to kind of show these objects keyframing, kind of exploding up or stretching out and then scaling back down, I have the ability to go in and select each type of object individually. Now, let's say I wanted to select each one of these columns individually. Right now they're sort of grouped together. So let's kind of real quickly go over some grouping and some organization methods. within Maya and its geometry. So let's look at these columns here. If I want to separate them, all I have to do is go to Mesh, Separate, and now they're individually selectable columns. Okay. And what you'll notice in your outliner is it created a new group for you called Structure. Now you can select the group and select them as a whole like this, or you can expand that group and select them individually. Now if I wanted to combine these back together again, I can select all of those objects, go to Mesh, Combine, and now they're back to one selectable object. Okay, I can double click this to rename it and call it Structure. And then you probably want to delete all this stuff which is left over. Just kind of get rid of that. No longer need it. Okay, so that's how you combine and separate objects. Let's see. The other thing I want to show you is how to reset your gumball. So if I hit W on the keyboard, you'll notice my gumball is defaulted to 0, 0, 0 on my grid. It's not put to the center of my geometry. All you have to do is select the geometry, go to Modify, Center Pivot, and that's going to recenter that geometry. Okay, so let's hop into SketchUp and just kind of go over the export settings for SketchUp. As I mentioned before, you want to make sure that you model things through components. And again, this is something you kind of have to know about going into or when you start your modeling. It really is sort of best practice. For any kind of modeling in SketchUp, you want to model through components. You want trim to be a component. You want floors to be a component. You want structure to be a component. So you really want to make sure that that's the way you're modeling when you do your SketchUp models. It just helps keep things kind of organized, and it also makes it a lot easier to export out objects on their own. So just like we did with Rhino, we're going to want to select each component and export it. And you just kind of have to keep track. You can use your tags to turn things on or off if that helps. So like if you export out the floors, you can turn off the floors so you remember that you exported those out. So what I'll do is I'm just going to do the columns. I'll select that component, go to File, Export, 3D Model. And you want to go into the options box before you do anything and make sure that export only current selection is checked. Okay, if this is unchecked, it's going to export everything in your SketchUp scene regardless of whether or not it's selected. You can turn on triangulate all faces. That helps create sort of cleaner geometry. You don't need these checked. You don't need texture maps checked, because we'll do any kind of texturing in Maya. And then again, swap YZ coordinates, Y is up, make sure that's checked, because in Maya, Y is up. So just leave that there, click OK, and then export out your geometry. And again, you just kind of got to run through component by component until you've exported everything out of SketchUp. And then again, Maya, it's just the same import process once you have OBJ geometry. Okay. So yeah, that's importing and exporting out of Rhino and SketchUp.